Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with the 7 ontological arguments for the existence of God. Today we are going to be looking at argument number 6, the religious experience ontological argument. Now, I outlined this argument as follows. The word God has meaning that is only revealed in religious experience. The word God only has meaning if God exists, therefore God exists. In this video, we're going to take a look at some reasons you might believe each of these premises and the conclusion, and then we're going to kind of take a look at a thought experiment that may make this argument a little bit more convincing than it already is. Let's take a look. So, first premise, the word God has meaning that is only revealed in religious experience. This seems fairly intuitive to those people who kind of believe in or understand the idea of religious experience. People only truly understand the concept of God in religious experience, and there is something that they're understanding. There is some meaning to the word God that they are understanding when they have a religious experience. There's something that is the object of that religious experience. That object is God. Premise 2, the word God only has meaning if God exists. Basically, if God has that meaning in religious experience, God is going to have to exist. If God didn't exist, then saying God would be akin to saying Santa Claus. When we're saying Santa Claus, we mean something that doesn't exist, but when we're saying God, we mean something that does exist. So we're clearly not using that reference. We're talking about God, something that exists, and it only has some kind of meaning if God in fact does exist. Therefore, God exists. This is just modus ponens from the first two. God has meaning. If God has meaning, then God exists. Therefore, God exists. Now, when I first encountered this argument, it was not very intuitive and not very persuasive to me. However, I've thought about it a little more, and I've kind of come up with a bit of a thought experiment that, at the very least, may make it a bit more persuasive, if not fully convincing, to anyone. Let's take a look. So, imagine a village. A bunch of people in it. And on the edge of this village, there is a very dark cave. It's impossible to see into this cave. It's a deep cave, but it's also a skinny cave, and only one person can go in at a time. So one day, Amy, who lives in the village, decides to go into the cave. She goes in, she comes back out, and she tells the villagers, there's a nice guy named George that lives there. He gave me some tea. Okay, Amy, great. The next day, Bob decides to see if Amy's telling the truth. He goes into the cave and he comes back out. He says, yeah, George is pretty cool. We talked about the weather and we drank tea. I don't know how George is talking about the weather if he spends all his life in a cave, but that's a separate point. Carl goes in the next day. He says, yep, I saw George wearing a yellow flannel shirt. He gave me some nice Earl Grey tea. Wonderful. It would seem at this point that the people in the village might suppose that there is a referent of the word George. There's something that all these people are referencing. A guy called George who exists in the cave. And probably likes tea. We're even understanding some of the properties of this thing that word is referencing. If the word George has some kind of meaning, it must mean that George exists. Because it has meaning, we're talking about him, we're understanding him in some way, so he has to exist. These people who've been in and seen him can discuss him, and the people even who haven't seen him can kind of learn about his properties. You might get disagreement about George if, for example, the next day Dave goes in and says, George and I had some tea, but he was wearing a red polo. Now, you might have a disagreement in the village where Dave and Bob say George wears a red polo, while Amy and Carl say he wears yellow flannel. But clearly, this might be some feature of George that, I don't know, he changes his shirt, and maybe the people in this village only have one shirt each, and so they're confused by this. The point is that disagreements about what George looks like or George's properties aren't going to get rid of this idea that they're still all talking about one thing, and that word George has a referent. It has something that it is referencing when they say George. It has that meaning. The problem comes, of course, when you have Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth has a bit of a problem. She's too tall. She's really tall. So she can't go into the cave. The cave, it's too short. The entrance is too short. There's no way she's going to get in to see George. So Elizabeth says, I've never seen George, so I think he doesn't exist. However, the others are going to dispute this with her. They're going to say, of course George exists. When we all say George, when we say the word George, we're referring to the same thing. We're talking about the guy in the cave that we all met. The word has meaning. in that it is talking about something that actually exists, and that meaning is only revealed in a cave. You only know what that word means when you go into that cave and see George. So, of course, George exists because we're all talking about him. That's my best job at kind of getting an intuition behind where this argument is coming from. In the next video, we'll take a look at some objections to the argument and some objections to kind of my thought experiment here. That was the religious experience, ontological argument for the existence of God. Next up, the last one we are going to be doing is going to be higher order ontological argument for the existence of God. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org and stay skeptical, everybody.